It was a beautiful sunny afternoon in the bustling heart of the city, where the park met the busy shopping street. The aroma of fresh coffee from nearby cafes blended with the chatter of people. The streets were alive with movement, a perfect scene for a Saturday afternoon. In the middle of all this activity, a black woman, dressed casually in a flowing dress, walked briskly with a small shopping bag in her hand. She had a calm demeanor, as if in her own world, focused on her thoughts. Her dark skin gleamed under the sun, and her face showed a quiet confidence. She was the kind of woman who didn't need attention to know her worth. She wasn't in a hurry, but her eyes constantly scanned the surroundings, as if waiting for someone. Her gaze would flicker towards a nearby cafe where she was supposed to meet a friend for lunch, but she seemed to be alone for now. People walked past her, some noticing her, some oblivious to her presence. It was the usual busy urban scene as she stood near the cafe, adjusting her bag. She didn't notice the small group of men nearby, hanging around a corner. The group was made up of 3 young men and 1 older guy. The older man had an intimidating look about him, dressed in a leather jacket, while the younger ones wore jeans and graphic tees. They were standing on the sidewalk, leaning against a street sign, seemingly just passing the time, but something about their body language wasn't right. They seemed to be eyeing people walking by, but there was a certain arrogance in their stares, as if they felt superior. The moment the woman passed by, one of the younger men, a tall, thin guy, let out a snide remark, loud enough for her to hear. "Nice shoes for a woman like you. Must be hard to afford those." The woman slowed her step, but she didn't stop. She didn't look at them, keeping her focus straight ahead. The other 2 men snickered quietly, sharing a laugh, while the older man grinned as though this was some game. The woman's heart skipped a beat, but she took a deep breath. She had experienced things like this before. She wasn't going to let them get to her. However, it didn't stop the comments from coming. "Bet you can't even speak proper English," another one of the young men shouted, his voice rising as he tried to provoke her. She kept walking, her face composed, but inside, the frustration was growing. Why do people feel the need to make such comments? Was it because of how she looked, how she spoke? She had no answers, but she knew this wasn't new. This was just another day in the world she lived in around them. The scene was still as lively as ever. People passed by, some hearing the comments but doing nothing, others pretending not to notice. There were a few who looked on with concerned expressions, but none of them stepped forward. She could feel their eyes on her, but none dared to intervene. It was the same old story, people witnessing something wrong but not wanting to get involved. The woman's hands tightened around her bag. She could feel her pulse quicken. The gang's comments continued, each one worse than the last. They were deliberately loud, trying to get a reaction from her, trying to see how far they could push her. The older man shouted again, this time with a mocking tone. "You should be grateful we even speak to you." But the woman kept walking, focusing on her breathing. It was hard to ignore the words, but she was determined not to show any sign of weakness. She had faced worse before, and she would get through this too. She tried to move faster, her heart racing now. But with every step, the taunts followed, and she couldn't help but feel small in that moment. Still, she didn't look back, not even once. She refused to give them the satisfaction. As the minutes passed, the harassment grew. They were no longer just making comments. They were following her now, their footsteps echoing in the quiet space between the people and stores. The woman's pace quickened, but so did the men behind her. She could hear their footsteps now, deliberately loud, drawing closer with every passing moment. At first, the comments were just rude remarks, things she could ignore. But now they were getting more aggressive. One of the younger men, the one who had started with the insults about her shoes, stepped in front of her, blocking her path. She stopped abruptly, her heart racing. The man smirked, clearly enjoying the discomfort he was causing. The older man, standing just behind him, crossed his arms, watching her with a cold, calculating expression. "Got somewhere to be?" the young man sneered, his tone mocking. Or are you too busy trying to be important in a place like this?" The woman's body tensed. She took a small step back, trying to maintain some space between them. She could feel the weight of their stares, and she could feel the air growing thicker around her, as if everyone had stopped moving, all attention focused on her. The once bustling street felt like it was closing in. "No, I'm fine," she said, her voice steady, but her hands tightened around her shopping bag. She didn't want to show them any fear, but her nerves were on edge. She could feel the anxiety creeping up, the need to move, to escape. But she refused to give in to it. The younger man laughed. "I don't think you're fine. Look at you, all scared and quiet. What's wrong, huh? Cat got your tongue?" Before she could respond, he reached out and knocked the bag from her hand, sending the contents spilling onto the pavement. Groceries scattered, some rolling away. The sound of the items crashing to the ground was loud in her ears, like a slap to her dignity. She stood frozen for a moment, her breath catching in her chest. For a brief second, she wanted to shout at him, to grab him by the shoulders and make him apologize, make him feel the weight of his actions. But she didn't. She didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Instead, she bent down to collect her things, but her hands were trembling now. She couldn't keep them steady. The younger man stepped forward again, his foot deliberately blocking her way as she reached for a rolling can. "What, you too good to pick up your stuff?" he taunted, smirking down at her. The older man laughed softly behind him, clearly enjoying the scene. He took a step forward, crossing the line between harmless harassment and full-blown intimidation. "You should know your place," the older man said, his voice cold and menacing. "People like you don't belong here. You should be grateful we're letting you be around us." The woman's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel her face flush with humiliation, anger rising within her. But she kept her gaze low, her eyes focusing on the ground, trying to ignore their words. "Calm down," she reminded herself. "Don't let them win. Don't let them make you lose yourself." She had to stay composed. As she finally stood up, bag in hand, she could see people walking by. None of them looked at her, and none of them stopped to help. It was as if she didn't exist, as if her suffering wasn't worth their time. She could feel her stomach turn at the thought. In that moment, she realized how truly alone she felt, but she pushed that feeling down. She had been taught by someone who loved her, someone who understood strength in silence, that sometimes the best thing to do was stay calm. Her husband had always told her that in situations like this, keeping control was the key. He was a Navy SEAL, someone who had seen the worst of humanity and learned to remain unaffected. "You need to stay calm, no matter what," her husband had once told her during one of their quiet evening talks. They had been sitting on the couch, his strong hand holding hers. His face was serious, but his eyes soft. "I've been in situations where everything around me was chaos. People screaming, fighting, and yet I had to stay focused. If you react in anger, if you let your emotions control you, you lose. They win." She had always admired his strength, his ability to remain calm in the face of danger. He had faced life-and-death situations, and yet he had always remained grounded. She had never been in such extreme situations, but his words had stuck with her. "I know it's not easy," he'd continued, "but it's in your moments of struggle that your true strength shows." As the woman stood in front of the gang now, recalling his words, she felt his presence in her heart. The memory of him calmed her nerves slightly, but the anxiety was still there. She had never been this close to real danger, and she could feel the situation spiraling out of control. Back in the present, the gang was getting bolder. One of the younger men stepped up again, this time trying to shove her. She stumbled back, almost losing her balance, but she managed to catch herself. The older man stepped forward, blocking her path once more, a smirk curling on his lips. "You're not going anywhere, lady," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Not until we're done having our fun." She could feel her heart hammering in her chest, her entire body tense. But despite the fear rising within her, She held her ground. She refused to let them break her. She refused to let them see her fall apart. As the woman tried to steady herself, the situation was quickly escalating. The gang was closing in on her, their taunts getting more and more hostile, the older man grinning as though this was some twisted game. She could feel her heart racing in her chest, and the sense of powerlessness was overwhelming. She had tried everything, ignoring, walking away, keeping her composure, but now she was trapped. There was nowhere to go. Just as the younger man reached forward again, his hand almost touching her arm, there was a sound, a car door slamming shut. The sound was sharp and cut through the tension like a sudden gust of wind. The gang stopped in their tracks, all of them turning their heads at once, their attention momentarily broken. The woman's heart skipped a beat when she saw him. Her husband. He stood there, leaning against his black SUV, dressed casually in a simple jacket and jeans. But there was something about him, his posture, the way he stood so still, so calm, that immediately caught the attention of everyone around. His dark eyes scanned the scene, taking in the situation with a quiet, calculating gaze. He wasn't running, wasn't shouting. He wasn't making a scene. But there was an undeniable presence about him. It wasn't the clothes, it wasn't the vehicle. No, it was the aura of someone who had seen far too much and understood just how dangerous a situation could become. It was as if everything around him slowed down. The way he moved, the way he looked at them, nothing seemed to faze him. To the casual observer, he seemed like an ordinary man, perhaps just another passerby. But to the gang, the air around him suddenly felt charged. He was no ordinary man. The gang exchanged glances, clearly confused. They didn't know who he was, but there was something unsettling about him. The younger man, who had been the most aggressive, looked at him, sneering, but his voice was laced with hesitation. "You got a problem, buddy?" he asked, trying to sound tough, but his words came out a bit strained, as if he wasn't sure what he was facing. The husband didn't answer immediately. He simply walked closer, his eyes locked on the gang's leader, the older man who had been overseeing everything from the start. He wasn't in a rush. There was no tension in his body, no sign of fear. His movements were calm, controlled, and deliberate, but there was an underlying threat in his every step as he reached the group. He stopped a few feet away from the gang leader. His eyes locked onto the man's, and he spoke in a low, steady voice. "Is there a problem here?" he asked. The words were simple, but the way he said them, without fear, without anger, immediately caused a shift. The gang leader took a half-step back, his cocky demeanor faltering for a second. There was something about this man that made him rethink his next move. The younger men, who had been so vocal only moments ago, now looked uncertain. The entire energy of the scene had changed, but the woman could only watch in stunned silence, her heart still racing. For a brief moment, no one spoke. The gang leader's jaw tightened, and he glanced at his friends, then back at the husband, trying to size him up. The woman could see the leader's mind working, trying to figure out if he could get away with confronting this man the way he had with her. Then the leader sneered. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he asked, taking a step toward the husband, trying to regain control of the situation. "Just some guy who thinks he can show up and tell us what to do?" The husband didn't flinch. He didn't even move an inch. His gaze never wavered. "No," he said calmly, "I think I'm the guy who's going to end this right now." There was a subtle change in his posture, a barely noticeable shift as he prepared himself for whatever might come next. And that was when it clicked. The gang members, though still trying to act tough, were now wary of him, their expressions changing from arrogance to uncertainty. They may not have known who he was, but they sensed something. The tension in the air thickened, and the gang leader hesitated. He was still trying to act tough, but now there was a fear creeping into his actions. He was stalling, trying to figure out how to get out of this without losing face. But the husband was still calm, his body language completely relaxed. Suddenly, one of the younger men, the one who had knocked over her bag earlier, took a step toward the husband, his eyes flashing with aggression. He swung his fist toward the husband's face, trying to strike him while his guard was down. It happened in an instant. The husband sidestepped, his movements almost too quick to follow, and before the young man could react, the husband had his arm twisted behind his back in a smooth, controlled maneuver. The gang member yelped in pain, struggling, but the husband held him there effortlessly. "What did I tell you?" the husband said quietly to the gang member, his voice still calm but now tinged with an undeniable edge. "I'm not the guy you want to mess with." The gang member stopped struggling, realizing that his attack had been neutralized with a speed and precision that spoke volumes. He stood there, frozen, as the husband calmly released him, pushing him back toward the group. The other gang members stood still, their mouths open in shock. The older man, who had been the leader all along, looked around at his gang, then back at the husband. He could see that his group had been humiliated, and the atmosphere was quickly turning hostile. Not toward the woman, but toward them. He gave a tight smile, but there was no warmth in it. "This isn't over," he muttered, but it was more to himself than to anyone else. Without another word, the gang turned and walked away, heads down, their pride wounded but their bodies intact. The husband watched them go, his eyes scanning the group to make sure they wouldn't turn back. As they disappeared into the crowd, he finally turned toward his wife. The gang, now standing in a loose formation, had stopped moving altogether. The tension in the air was thick, heavy, like the calm before a storm. The leader, trying to salvage whatever pride he had left, clenched his fists and took a step forward. His earlier bravado was gone, replaced with uncertainty and fear, but his ego refused to let him back down completely. The husband stood still, his posture relaxed, but his eyes were focused and unwavering. He didn't need to move, didn't need to show any aggression. His mere presence had already changed the game. The gang leader had sensed it. He knew he couldn't win a physical fight, but he wasn't going to just walk away in front of his crew. His last remaining shred of control depended on how he handled this moment. For a brief moment, the gang leader's eyes locked onto the husband's, measuring him, trying to gauge if there was any weakness, any hesitation. But there was none. The husband's calm demeanor remained steadfast, an impenetrable wall that made the leader's attempts to provoke him feel pointless. The leader scoffed, trying to force a sneer on his face. "You think you've won? You think you can just show up and intimidate us into backing off?" His voice was shaky, but he tried to mask it with bravado. "This is far from over. You don't know who we are." The husband remained silent for a long moment. He wasn't interested in arguing. He wasn't interested in wasting words. With a slow, deliberate movement, he took a step forward, unhurried, unbothered. The woman watched in awe as he walked, his calmness in stark contrast to the storm of hostility that had erupted just moments before when the husband spoke again. His voice was steady, almost gentle, but with an unmistakable authority. "I don't need to know who you are," he said softly. "What I need you to understand is that this ends now." The gang leader's face flushed with frustration. He opened his mouth to retort, but the words never came. The husband moved again, closer this time, and the air around them seemed to pulse with the silent promise of violence. Violence that would come not in the form of fists or weapons, but in a single, controlled moment. The leader's bravado cracked. The man took a half-step back, eyes darting toward his gang, searching for support, but finding none. The younger men, once so eager to escalate, were now watching with wide eyes, their hands trembling. The husband's quiet strength was unnerving, and they realized just how outmatched they were. They had underestimated him, and now they were stuck. The leader's hands shook slightly, and he tried to stand tall, trying to regain control of the situation. "You think you can just walk away from this? You think I'm going to let you walk all over us?" He stepped forward again, his chest puffed out, his words growing louder in a desperate attempt to save face. But before he could say another word, the husband's movements were a blur. In one smooth, fluid motion, he reached out and grabbed the leader by the wrist. The gang leader froze, his words dying on his lips as he tried to pull away, but the husband's grip was unyielding. "Listen to me," the husband said, his voice low and unwavering. "You're not in control anymore. You've lost." The gang leader struggled, his face red with embarrassment, but there was no escaping the fact that he was completely out of his depth. The woman saw it then, how completely helpless the leader had become, how utterly powerless he was in the face of her husband's calm authority. The rest of the gang members, once so confident, were now retreating mentally. They couldn't hide the fear that was beginning to bubble to the surface. One of the younger men shifted nervously from foot to foot, unsure of what to do. Another glanced around, looking for an exit, a way out. The husband's grip tightened, but he didn't twist or hurt the leader. He didn't need to. He had already won. There was no fight left. "This is the end for you," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of finality that hung in the air like a sentence. The gang leader's face twisted in anger and humiliation. He could feel the eyes of his gang on him. He knew he had no choice but to retreat. This wasn't a fight he could win. He was out of his depth. His control over his crew, his dominance over the situation, had slipped through his fingers. The leader jerked his arm away, and for the first time he seemed to acknowledge the truth. He turned to his gang members, a flicker of defeat in his eyes, and said the words no one wanted to hear. "Let's go," he muttered, his voice a mixture of anger and helplessness. Without another word, the gang began to retreat, their arrogance replaced by fear, their confidence shattered. The younger men glanced at one another nervously before turning to leave. The gang leader, still trying to salvage some of his pride, shot one last look at the husband, this time not with anger, but with a quiet, grudging respect. He knew they were beaten as the gang disappeared into the crowd. The woman exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her body trembled, but it wasn't out of fear anymore. It was a rush of relief, of realization that justice had been served. She looked at her husband, who was still standing tall, his posture relaxed, as though nothing had happened. To him this was just another day, another moment where calm had triumphed over chaos. The moment was cathartic, not just for the woman, but for the crowd that had witnessed the entire thing. For them, it was a reminder that sometimes justice wasn't about fists or chaos. Sometimes it was about standing firm in the face of fear and showing that there's no place for bullies in this world. The woman stepped toward her husband, a sense of pride swelling in her chest. She had never been more grateful for the calm strength he carried with him. In that moment, she knew that no matter what came their way, they could face it together. And for the gang, they would never forget the lesson they had learned today, the lesson that power was not always about how loud you could shout, but about how steady you could stand when the world tried to break you. The noise of the retreating gang faded into the background, leaving only the soft sounds of the bustling street around them. The woman stood there, her body still trembling, but her heart full of a different emotion now, relief. She turned to face her husband, her eyes meeting his with a deep sense of gratitude and love. She took a step toward him, her voice steady but full of emotion. "Thank you," she said quietly, her words carrying more weight than just gratitude. "You didn't have to do that, but I'm glad you were here." The husband gave her a small smile, his expression softening. He reached out and gently took her hand in his, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "You don't have to thank me," he replied, his voice calm. "You handled yourself with strength. I was just there to make sure you knew you weren't alone." She looked at him, feeling a wave of admiration for the man standing before her. She had always known he was strong, but seeing him in action like this, how he had taken control of the situation with such grace and confidence, only deepened her respect for him. But even more than that, it made her realize something important. It wasn't just about physical strength. It was about standing up for what's right, about not allowing fear or hatred to dictate how you live your life." The husband looked down at her, his expression shifting slightly, his eyes narrowing with a quiet intensity. "You know," he began, his tone serious, "what happened today wasn't just some random act of aggression. It was about something much deeper, racism. It's a poison that spreads through our society, trying to make people feel less than who they are. But we can't let that happen. We can't let people think they can treat others with disrespect because of their skin, their accent, or where they come from." He paused, looking around for a moment, his voice growing even more resolute. "Respect is the foundation of everything. We have to respect ourselves and each other. That's the only way to create a world where this kind of thing doesn't happen anymore." The woman nodded, taking his words to heart. She knew he was right. The world was full of hate, but it was also full of people willing to fight against it, people willing to stand up for what's right. It was about having the courage to speak out, to fight back, and to demand respect. They stood together for a moment, their hands still intertwined, letting the weight of the situation sink in. Then, without another word, they turned and began walking down the street. The world around them seemed quieter now, more peaceful, as if the chaos of the past few minutes had melted away as they walked, side by side. The woman couldn't help but feel a sense of empowerment. This moment, this fight, had not just been about protecting her, it had been about standing up for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly, everyone who had ever felt silenced. For the audience, the takeaway was clear. Standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. And sometimes the strongest weapon we have isn't a fist or a fight. It's our voice, our willingness to demand dignity and respect for ourselves and others. The couple walked on, their steps steady, their hearts full of hope for a better world.